As both a high school educator who loves teaching and as a parent, I have grave concerns about a mindset that I have witnessed evolve over the past 20 years in many of our young people. A mindset that I believe my own profession and many parents are unwittingly, yet largely responsible for. Specifically, my concern relates to an emphasis in our elementary and middle schools on the use of external rewards, or perks, pizza parties, candy, etc., that are used in an attempt to motivate or bribe our students and children to read, study, perform, or behave. Though well-intentioned, study after study clearly suggests that these practices are counterproductive because a child promised a treat for learning or acting responsibly has been given every reason to stop doing so when there is no longer a reward to be gained. Simultaneously, intrinsic motivation, an interest in doing something for its own sake, quickly erodes and is soon lost to extrinsic motivation. Completion of an activity or task is seen chiefly as a prerequisite for obtaining something else. Cohn, from 1993, argues that the reason this happens is that when someone says, do this and you will get that, it automatically devalues this. The recipient of the reward figures that if they have to be bribed, it must be something they wouldn't want to do for its own sake. How much sadder a message could we communicate to our kids if our goal is one of inspiring lifelong learning for its inherent worth? That passage I just read to you comes from this book, Zen and the Art of Public School Teaching, a self-published volume from John Perricone, longtime educator in upstate New York and truly inspiring human being. Thank you for listening to me read to you from this book to start off today's presentation. Welcome formally to the presentation titled Reading Ain't Fun When I Have to Do a Packet. My name is Latimer Hoke. I'm a teacher at Lincoln County High School in Eureka, Montana, and this is a presentation I prepared for the MFPE Virtual Educator Conference 2020. On this slide, you also have my email address, which is the best way to contact me if you have any feedback or questions or want to continue the dialogue about what I have to share with you today. Before we go any further, I thought I'd share a bit about me. I've been a high school English and healthcare professions teacher in Eureka, Montana since 2015. I moved to Eureka from northwestern Vermont, where I was 12 miles from the border. Now I live 8 miles from the border. I grew up on a subsistence farm in northwestern Vermont, and then I attended the University of Vermont for secondary English education. I have been a ski instructor, a lifeguard instructor, CPR first aid instructor, worked for over 10 years now as an advanced EMT for various ambulance services. After moving to Eureka, not surprisingly, I found a greater love for outdoor adventure, greater than I had in Vermont. I enjoy bicycling, bicycle touring, skiing. I do some ski patrolling. Just generally love the outdoors in Montana. I also am one of the assistant coaches for the Lincoln County High School cross-country running team. In the 2019 season, I had the distinct honor of being assistant to the coach of the year, which is sort of like assistant to the regional manager. So enough about me. Let's jump into this presentation. This is my first time recording a digital presentation to send out there to I don't even know who, and I don't have an opportunity to dialogue with the people in this session. So this should be interesting, which is why I have my contact information on that first page. I truly would love any feedback you have for me, good, bad, neutral. If you want to continue the conversation about these ideas, I would love to do that too, and my email address would be the best way to contact me. All right, let's go.
Seems so easy, seems so easy, seems so easy. Oh, so doggone easy, doggone easy, doggone easy. It seems so easy, seems so easy, seems so easy, seems so easy.
The first step in using novel ties is to distribute to each student a copy of the novel and a folder containing all of the duplicated worksheets. Begin instruction by selecting several pre-reading activities in order to set the stage for the reading ahead. Vocabulary exercises for each chapter always precede the reading so that new words will be reinforced in the context of the book. Use the questions on the chapter worksheets for class discussion or as written exercises. I found this in a filing cabinet in my classroom. It's from 1993 when I was 2 years old. And as I looked at the format of the assignments in here, I thought, I've definitely done some of these as a student when I was in high school. Now, just because I was 2 when this book was published, and I was -6 when the first edition was published, that does not inherently devalue something like this. However, the reason I played that Buddy Holly clip is it's so easy and so tempting as a teacher to hand out a bunch of books and a packet to go with it. We have so many things vying for our time, especially if we happen to coach some sports teams or any extracurriculars, or we're club advisors, or we have meetings to attend and parents to call, behavior issues to deal with. It's so easy to just get one of these things, send it through the ditto machine, and call it good. But in this presentation, I'm going to advocate strongly to overcome the temptation to just grab one of these. So let's first address this question. Why do we have our students read? Is it to put them to sleep, like we see in my classroom here? In elementary school, and sometimes before, this is where students learn to read. After they've learned to read, then they read to learn. We say we want our students to be lifelong learners, and in order to do this, one of the most important things we can do is to build a love for reading. As such, we as teachers cannot have kids do things that make them dislike reading. We had a PIR session one day, a professional development, with the guest speaker, Denny McLaughlin, and he said to us, you can't teach a negative, you can only teach a positive. I tend to disagree with that a little bit, and so I'm going to go ahead and give you some things that we should not be doing if we want our kids to continue to love reading. The first is we should not give external incentives. That's why I started off with that passage from John Perricone's book. We should not give rewards for reading. Reading itself should be the reward, and that's what we should be aiming to do as teachers. In these pictures here on this slide, there's a picture of me being zapped by who knows how many volts in a Tough Mudder. I did one of those and never again. There's a picture of me. I climbed to the top of a mountain in June so I could go skiing. And there's a picture of me finishing the Missoula Marathon. None of these things did I do for external incentives. 2 of them, the paid competitions there, the marathon and the Tough Mudder, I received a t-shirt. But realistically, that t-shirt cost something like $60 or $70, and I had to do some crazy amount of exertion for it. If I wanted this shirt, I could just get the shirt. Probably cheaper if I just went the next year and bought one. And we recognize for sure that people do physical endeavors for internal reasons, or for just paltry external reasons that just are laughable when you compare them to the actual effort. So as teachers, we should celebrate the idea that we could do intellectual challenges simply for the sake of learning. If running can be a reward, then so can learning. Next, we shall not ask our students to regurgitate things. And if you're wondering what regurgitation would be, it's truly anything that asks students to just repeat back exactly what it is they read on the page. If they can go and look and find the answer in the text, word for word, that's regurgitation. So I have a couple example questions here. One is from Catcher in the Rye. Why did Holden call Stradlater a secret slob? You could go and find the exact passage where he describes Stradlater as a secret slob. Side note, I really don't like Catcher in the Rye. Send me an email if that makes you angry. This other one, why does Okonkwo wish that his daughter Ezinma had been born a boy? And that's from the novel Things Fall Apart. At first glance, we would look at these questions and we'd say they are good why questions. So we'd say, oh, it starts with why, it's a higher order thinking question. That's an okay rule of thumb, but it's certainly not a universal. And these questions just require that you go and look exactly in the book and see where it is the character explains themselves. Anyone can answer these questions if they just read the book and are looking for the answer. Asking for regurgitation serves only as a gotcha for those who didn't read, and it forces a reader to focus on something that might not have otherwise been that important to them, given their lens into the novel. And remember that all of our students are coming to these books that we ask them to read from a different perspective. And when we ask our pre-formed questions like this, it forces them to focus on something that might not be interesting to them. We might think it's important, but something else that they pick up on in the book might be far more important to them and far more interesting. And if we could hear from them what was important and why it was important and what was interesting, why it was interesting to them, we would learn a lot from them, and it would cultivate their experience a bit stronger with the book. I, as a reader, never want to be asked to simply regurgitate what I read, unless it's trivia night. I want to be asked to use and interact with what I read. Since everyone approaches a text with a different worldview, they are going to interact with the text differently. And that individual, unique interaction, that is, I think, why we read and why we should have our students learn to love to read. All right, this one might be controversial. No quote quotas. Quotas are bad in college admissions and they're bad in policing. At least that's what the courts say. Quotas for quotes or for anything inherently devalue what we're doing and what the true goal of reading is. They instantly fall victim to something called Goodhart's Law. Quick detour on Goodhart's Law. Goodhart's Law is an economic principle that as soon as you identify something as a measure for success, it ceases to be a valuable measure of success. It's kind of a paradox. The best example I've heard of this is a grocery store that wanted to have their cashiers scan items faster. As they basically said, whoever scans items the fastest will win an award. And there was one cashier who admitted in a podcast that if an item was too hard to scan or took too long, he would just zing it down the conveyor belt for free for the customer, effectively stealing thousands of dollars from his employer. But he won that award. He was like Employee of the Month, fastest scanner on the whole line. So basically, as soon as the grocery store said, what's important is fast scanning, the employees found a way to achieve that, and the store, if they'd really known what was happening, probably would not have been happy with it. And the same thing will happen to us as teachers if we tell students that they need to have a certain number of quotes or aha moments or questions about the text. That now makes reading this externally demanded task. Obviously we want our students to notice passages or quotes or aha moments. Theoretically, we want those passages, those quotes, those aha moments, those questions. We want students to do something with them. Those quotes, they're a means to an end. So the end result there, that's the accountability. That's the measure of success. Otherwise, students are going to start to learn that, I just need 3 quotes and 2 questions and 1 aha, and that's what reading is, and that seems really boring. I don't like reading anymore. I'm violating PowerPoint rules here with having just a giant quote on here. One of my most inspiring teachers was my 10th grade English teacher, and so I have 2 quotes from him here. I had asked him when I started teaching 10th grade English if he had any advice for me, and so he sent me a very long email, and I pulled a couple quotes from that email. His advice has stuck with me and is why I approach reading the way I do with my students. Here's the first quote. English was probably a class where they had read a piece of text, pointed out whatever inane literary device was the topic du jour, and taken a quiz on what color was the lamplight Gatsby saw coming from Daisy's house across the lake. Maybe, on a rare occasion, they'd write a short piece of exposition that as long as it had 5 paragraphs and 1 or 2 quotes would be enough to earn them a passing grade. But this denies not only your purpose as a teacher, but theirs as a student. Show them they have a voice. Teach them to use it. Empower them. And here's the second quote that sticks with me from him. Often I learned just as much from my students as I hope they learned from me. Their unique baggage with which they engaged the text gave them a unique insight into the story to which I was not privy. Understanding that is a humbling experience. Okay, so now that I've identified some of my pet peeves about teaching reading in school, I guess I should probably give you some advice for what to do. The first piece I have for you is that choice in reading should be the rule, not the exception. And think about this. If we go to a PE class, like a weightlifting class, the PE teacher doesn't force everyone to bench press the same exact weight. And I think we should think of reading the same way. Reading is exercise, and everyone has different abilities, different strengths, and a different exercise zone. Too light, for example, and that's going to do nothing. That's not going to exercise us. If it's too heavy, we can't even budge the darn thing. Books are no different than weights in this respect. So we might like to have the whole class read a book together. However, for some students, that book actually might be too heavy, metaphorically speaking, or possibly literally. Some of these textbooks these days, man. But another way to look at this is that sometimes we are all going to read the same book because there is value in that too. And maybe that's harder for one person than it is for another. Probably it is. But think about this like carrying groceries in from the car. Some people can carry all of the groceries in from the car in one trip, staggering and panting and just barely making it to the counter in the kitchen before all the bags break. And some people aren't physically strong enough to carry all of that. They're going to have to take multiple trips. So for those who have to take multiple trips, it's simply going to take longer, but they will actually accomplish the task. Same with reading. Okay, so this book is hard for you, or you're a slow reader. All right, that's okay, but you can still do it. It's just going to take you longer. And or you might need some other tools. Maybe you need something with wheels on it to carry your groceries. Maybe you need an audiobook to help you access the text. I think we all need to read in our exercise zones, but we also need to read for fun, and we need to use these reading muscles that we develop to tackle ever-increasing challenges, or there's little purpose to the exercise. I want us to think a little bit about critical theory here. Probably most of us watching this video are English teachers or reading teachers at some level, and probably, hopefully, we love to read, and we maybe love to discuss reading, and maybe we loved our English classes in school, hopefully. So critical theory, what I mean by this is critical meaning the same as like criticism or critique. And there are different approaches for how to criticize or think critically about text. Different lenses we can look at a text through. I favor a version of literalism, as in what is written there on the page, mixed with the reader's own worldview when they come to that text. That is what the text means. It doesn't matter necessarily what the author was trying to get across. What is written mixed with the reader's own baggage, that's what the text means to that reader. As teachers, though, then we can add some historical and authorial context, and sometimes that can shift the meaning for the student. Like, oh, now I understand Mark Twain's use of some pretty uncouth language. Stuff that we would say is racist today, but at the time probably was not viewed as racist, at least not by the majority of Mark Twain's white readers. I think a lot of English teachers focus too heavily on intentionalism, as in asking students, what do you think the author was trying to do here? It's fun to do that sometimes as an exercise, but at best, for most cases, especially if the author's dead, we can only speculate. I think a better question to ask students is, what did the author do for you when you were reading this? Or what did the author do to you when you were reading this? I mean, I think reading is actually a physical experience. I physically experience things when I read, and not just my butt falling asleep, but physical manifestations of emotions. And so in that respect, yeah, the author did something to me. That's a more interesting question, I think, than what do you think the author was trying to do? I mean, that's like intent versus impact. I don't care what the author intended. I care what the author did. All of that said, though, I think it's valuable for English and reading teachers, language arts teachers, to be able to look at texts we assign we should be able to evaluate these from a variety of different critical perspectives so that we can play the devil's advocate for our students as a means of generating some robust discussion about literature. I like to teach reading focusing on big ideas, also known as themes. Got a little side topic here is I have a lot of students for some reason they have this misconception that a theme in a book is like the message or the moral of the story. And I always have to correct them. I say, no, that's the message or the moral of the story. A theme is just a big idea that we can connect to something else in the world. Love, friendship, revenge, grief, those are big ideas. Those are themes. I also like to connect events from the plot of whatever book we happen to be reading to the world around us and current events. I think that's a great way to make reading relevant for students. And even if they haven't done the reading that I hoped they would do, they can still participate in these conversations and they can still pick up on these big ideas. I think these larger ideas for us to ponder, those are more important than reading a specific book. But by having this book that we're reading, I have a bit of defense for the crazy lessons that I might bring into class. When I read The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien with my students, there's a scene where a new army medic fails to treat the main character for shock, and so I, as an EMT, teach my students in English class how to treat for shock and how to stop bleeding and how to apply tourniquets. And if someone were to say, well, what does that have to do with English? I'd say, well, we just read about it in the book. And here's the thing, even if the students didn't do the reading, well, now they know how to stop bleeding, so they'll probably be able to use that someday if they're unlucky. I remember in high school, I had some teachers who would hammer on symbolism and motifs and literary devices. And while those can be interesting, I know that they were a bit of a turnoff for me. I just wanted to read the story. And I know that they were a turnoff for a lot of my classmates. I like to teach that English stuff, symbolism, literary techniques, literary devices, stuff like that. I like to teach that by side effect. And yes, in this picture, that actually is a real bottle of vitamins that I found at my brother's house one day. Yikes. So all of that English stuff of what's going on, I don't want to look too closely at it. Again, I have that theory about that Goodhart's law applies to English class as well. And if I spend too much time on it, the kids are just going to turn off to reading altogether. So I drop in little bits and pieces of symbolism. And certainly when we read Shakespeare, I point out puns because I love puns. I don't make that the main course of my English class when we're reading. Students might nerd out about some of that stuff and they might love it and they might pursue that further in the future. But I also have a lot of students who might enjoy the story that we're reading, but if I start to spend too long on those literary devices, they're going to forget it, they're going to hate it, and they're going to want it. They're just going to zone out and walk away from my lesson and away from reading. Sometimes a story is just a story. A story can be much more than just a story, but sometimes it should be allowed to be just a story. Other things I do, another example from The Things They Carried by Tim O'Brien. I've had my students, when I think I have the right group of students to do this and the weather's right outside, we'll go outside and we'll march and sing in military formation to show them the power of walking and singing together and how that can actually build a team pretty effectively. When I read Interpreter of Maladies with my seniors in world literature, it's a book about Indian American immigrants by Jhumpa Lahiri. I try to, again, if I have the right group of students and the scheduling works out well, I try to have us go and make a dish with a lot of Indian style spices. When I read Cool Hand Luke by Don Pierce with my students, there's a scene in there where where Don Pierce describes how to take off a pair of pants while wearing leg shackles. So I went online and I bought some leg shackles. A little weird, maybe. And then I bring in some wind pants, uh, and we practice the art of taking off a pair of pants over leg shackles. I truly want people to understand the experience of reading. I want them to experience the story. And all of that other English stuff, I even have students tell me that my class doesn't feel like a real English class, but they are engaged and they are now understanding that story a little bit more. And when I drop in little bits and nuggets here and there about what the writer's doing with their techniques, yeah, I'll have students pick up on that, and I don't spend too long on it because the ones who don't care are already starting to zone out and their mind's drifting away. And the ones who do care about it, they might come have lunch with me and we can really dive into the text and pick it apart even closer if they want to. The final piece I'm going to leave you with today is the power of reading out loud to all ages, especially high school. I definitely remember in elementary school my teachers reading to us. Usually they'd read a novel to us, and I know I loved it, and I remember my classmates loving it. For some reason, somewhere around 4th or 5th grade, or basically whenever the expectation is that students can read to themselves, reading out loud to students, it kind of just drops off. Or we start to force the students to read out loud in front of each other. I like to read out loud to my high schoolers because it's probably, for most of them, it's been a while since someone read a book to them. And I'm certain that reading out loud to younger kids is valuable. There's a boatload of research out there that says if you read to kids when they're like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, they are going to do far better in life than kids who no one ever read to. So I like to pull out that reading out loud card again when kids are in 10th grade, and I'll read an entire novel to them. Usually for the last 2 weeks of the school year, it's nice outside. We can go outside. They can sit on the grass, and I'll read a book to them. And I even have students who become so engaged in that, students who haven't read much all year, that they will actually steal a spare copy of whatever book I happen to be reading so they can read ahead. And I think that's like the greatest success ever. I also tell them not to do it, so of course now they will. I had one student actually finish a book early one day, just in class as I was kind of talking about what we just read, and she took the last 10 minutes of class while I was chatting and we were discussing what we'd read. She was just had her nose in the book reading it, and I look over and she's just weeping. I look over and I said, "You finished the book, didn't you?" And she said, "Yes." Reading out loud is a great way to bring people into a story. And here's another thing that reading out loud can do. When I read, and probably when most of us who are watching this video, when we read, we have that movie playing in our mind, but it's like better than a movie. At least I hope that we have that, and if you don't, you're missing out. But a lot of our students, especially the ones who say they don't like reading, they don't have that movie playing in their mind. They just have words on a page. And I've noticed that when I read out loud to my students, and I kind of get into it, waving my arms and doing voices for the different characters, I'm certain that the story comes to life for those students who usually don't like to read. I'm also hoping that by reading out loud to students, especially at older ages, they'll start to remember, they'll remember a positive experience with reading out loud, and they will also be able to follow along because they can read to themselves now too. They'll be able to follow along in a copy of a book while I'm reading that book out loud, and they'll be able to see what I'm doing and hopefully connect those dots. Sometimes I even will stop and give a little lesson about how I choose to present things, what punctuation I'm following, how I'm choosing what words to emphasize as I read out loud, so that I am dropping in that art of reading out loud and trying to share that with students so that hopefully that lesson gets encoded a little bit so they'll be able to do that for people in the future. Now you might have noticed that I had a bit of a disparaging reaction when I mentioned that we have students go around the room and read out loud. I am not a huge fan of making kids do that. I mean, For one, kids are mean to each other, but my main objection is that that style truly starts to obscure the meaning of what we're trying to read. So, here's my rule of thumb on this one. Anything that needs to be read out loud for meaning should be read out loud by someone who is good at reading out loud. That could be a student who is good at reading out loud and enjoys it, and if they're good at it, their classmates will want to listen to them. I've had my students request that another student read instead of me because that student has actually a better read out loud voice than I do. And you've been listening to this presentation for long enough now, and you're like, yeah, I'd like someone else's voice by now too. Here's the other thing. When we bounce around between this mandated, uncomfortable monotone, not following the punctuation and not reading it how it was meant to be read, all of that happens, and then of course the student who has no idea where we are, and now we've disrupted this, and we've actually pulled ourselves out of the reading experience into, can't you just follow along? All of that obscures the meaning of what we're trying to read. That said, I do want my students, who will probably mostly be parents someday, I want them to be able to read out loud well to their kids. And so we do need to work on the reading out loud skills. A lot of students don't have those skills yet. So remember we talked about earlier, first students learn to read, and then they read to learn. So you want to think about this if you're going to have a reading task where you want everyone's attention devoted to a certain passage that you're going to share together. Is this the time that you want people learning to read aloud? Or is this when you want there to be a read aloud to learn? And if it's a read aloud to learn, then you need to have someone who's just good at reading aloud, just reading that passage. And if it's multiple pages, you could break that up between different readers if you wanted, but the bouncing around, everyone has to read a paragraph, or everyone has to read a sentence, I think that destroys a story, and I think it obscures meaning. So there's my perspective on reading out loud, that we should do it at all ages, and that we should be deliberate about it, and we should make sure that it's a positive listening experience for those who are not reading. And that brings us to the end of the presentation of Reading Ain't Fun When I Have to Do a Packet. Hopefully you've been able to pick up something from this, maybe some things you want to step away from in your own teaching practice, maybe some things you want to embrace in your teaching practice. I recognize this presentation is a little shorter than the 50 minutes allotted for it, so you could take that time to shoot me a quick email. Any thoughts you have on this presentation, if anything I can do better for online presenting, anything you want to dialogue back and forth about, I would love to do that. My email address is there. It's quite complicated, latimerhoke@gmail.com. I hope you have a great rest of your conference. Thanks for listening to what I had to say today, and I hope you enjoy your other sessions.